There was only one sentence echoing through the long corridors of Chase Center. "Either change me or stop paying me." At that moment, time seemed to stand still inside the Golden State Warriors arena. These words were not a rumor leaked by a manager. This was Jonathan Kaminga speaking out loud and clear, in his own voice and on his own terms. His words hung in the air, bouncing off every wall. For a moment, everyone looked at each other. It was as if a bomb had just dropped into the heart of the organization. And the target of that bomb wasn't just the team's upper management. It was Steve Kerr himself. At that moment, something had shaken the very foundation of the Golden State dynasty. Take a second break from the story and subscribe to the channel below if you want to see more stories. The Golden State Warriors have been the embodiment of a different philosophy, for years. It wasn't just about playing basketball. It was about being part of an order, sharing, patience, discipline, and harmony. Kerr had a culture that had grown over the years. This culture, combined with Steph Curry's calm leadership and his teammates' dedication, had led to one of the NBA's greatest successes. But the most important condition of that system was this: waiting for your turn. Young players would stay quiet, work hard, and wait for their turn. Even the stars weren't allowed to be selfish. That morning, that rule was suddenly broken, because Kaminga didn't want to wait anymore. The impact of his words didn't stay inside the building. In no time, it was all over social media, on TV, and even talked about throughout the league. Trade me or pay me. This sentence wasn't really a demand. It was the declaration of a player who had reached the end of his patience. It was almost like a war against the silent authority that had come from Golden State's past. A young player who was once seen as the face of the future now seemed to want to shape his own future with his own hands. For those who knew Kaminga's story, this outburst was not really a surprise. Since the day he stepped into the league, his athleticism, potential, and ambition had already been on everyone's lips. But there was a wall in front of him. That wall was Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green. They were legends, but they were also shadows. Kaminga sat on the sidelines for years. He gave his all in training and made the most of the few chances he was given on the court. But every time he stepped into the spotlight, he was pulled back to the bench. Every time, he was told to wait for his time to come. But that time never came. Patience no longer felt like growth to him, but like a chain. The words that broke that chain were, "Either change me or pay me." This time, the message did not go through an agent, nor was it whispered through the back door. These words were directed at Steve Kerr. Kerr wasn't just a coach. Kerr was also the architect of this system. His name was a symbol of the Warriors' culture and discipline. For a young player to openly mention his name was something that broke the club's unspoken rules. That's why this incident was a sign of something much bigger than a mere contract dispute. The atmosphere in the building became very heavy. The veteran players looked at each other. Some of them looked angry, because in their eyes this was disrespect for the order. The young players, on the other hand, silently understood Kaminga. They felt the same way, but couldn't put it into words. Now someone had finally said it out loud. The conversations in the locker room grew shorter. The cheerful post-practice chats had been replaced by a cold silence. And in that silence, everyone thought the same thing. Is this club splitting in two? The crisis that began with Kaminga's departure was also the beginning of a much bigger story. This wasn't just about a player wanting more playing time. It was a battle between the old and the new. On one side was a group clinging to the victories of the past, and on the other were young players eager to carve out their own path toward the future. These words may have sparked a process that will determine the future of the Golden State Warriors. Everything changed after that day. The Golden State Warriors' offseason would no longer be quiet. The quiet rebuilding plan that everyone had been waiting for was suddenly shattered. Because Jonathan Kaminga, with a single sentence, had shattered the balance of the dynasty. The echo of that sentence was still reverberating. Everyone had one question on their minds. Would this move save his career, or would it spell the end of the dynasty? As the impact of that sentence spread throughout the club, images of the last 4 years flashed through Jonathan Kaminga's mind like a movie reel. But when he arrived in Golden State, he was chasing a dream. He wanted to be part of one of the NBA's greatest teams, grow alongside the stars, and slowly make his way to center stage. He still remembered the words spoken to him on his first day. Be patient. Keep working. When the time comes, you'll make your leap. And he believed it every time. From the first summer league, he worked out for hours. He stayed alone in the gym at night. When the team's experienced players looked at him, they saw a young boy, but he wanted to prove that he was the star of the future. But after every game, he faced the same scene, waiting on the sidelines, sometimes shining for a few minutes, then being forgotten again. As he sat on the bench, the cheers faded away. Even the light in the fans' eyes couldn't reach him. Months passed. Seasons changed. Each time, he was silenced with the same phrase, "Your turn will come. Your turn will come." But that turn never came. Because that's not how the Golden State system works. Because that system was built on loyalty to experience. No matter how bright the young players were, they were not allowed to shine. At least, not right away. The burden of patience that had been growing inside him had become unbearable. Because time was passing. Every year, hundreds of players took the stage in the NBA, some becoming stars, others fading into obscurity. That's why Kaminga felt stuck in the middle. He couldn't break out, but he couldn't give up either. With each passing day, he felt like he was losing a piece of that much talked about potential. When he got a chance to play in a few games mid-season, he shone on the court once again. He showed everyone his athleticism, his strength, his desire to make a difference. But that sparkle was short-lived. When he was sidelined again, he realized that no matter how hard he tried, he would not be able to take control of his own destiny, because this system still did not trust him, and that distrust had slowly planted the seeds of his departure. He remained silent for a long time. Perhaps he thought that one day his patience would be rewarded. But as the days passed, the picture he saw was the same as always. The same rotation, the same priorities, and the same fixed roles. It seemed he had little chance other than waiting behind the veterans. Some events within the team hurt him even more. One day, after practice, he overheard a conversation among his teammates. No one meant any harm, but the words stuck in his ears. He wasn't ready for the big stage yet. Those words weighed heavily on him because no one had ever asked him if he was ready. From that moment on, a decision became clear in his mind. If they didn't see his value, then he would certainly forge his own path. Instead of waiting, he chose to speak up. That's why those words were more of a declaration than a request. Either they would recognize his value, or he would build his future with another team. This statement was not just words. It was the weight of years that had accumulated inside him. And this weight was now stronger than all the patience he had carried. That's why there was no turning back. As the echoes of those words still reverberated through the team building, the veteran players quietly retreated to their corners. Draymond Green's face showed no expression, but his gaze had hardened. For players like him, such a challenge was a breach of a sacred order. For the young players, it was the voice of courage. Two different worlds existed side by side in the same room. Social media picked up on these words and made them headlines. Trade me or pay me. Overnight, this sentence became the most talked about topic not just for the team, but for the entire league. Some commentators saw this as the birth of the future, others as disrespect. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. Nothing would ever be the same again. After saying those words, Kaminga locked himself in his room. He could see the storm raging outside, but there was also a sense of relief inside him, because he was no longer silent. For the first time, he had done something for himself and spoken up, and for the first time, he had decided to chart his own path. And that night, the Golden State Warriors weren't just experiencing a contract crisis. The cracks that had been silently waiting within the team for years had begun to grow. When morning came, the atmosphere at Chase Center was completely different. Everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence between the walls of the team was about to turn into a much louder noise, because the process that began with this sentence seemed to determine not only Kaminga's future, but also that of the dynasty. After these words, the atmosphere within the club had become increasingly heavy. There was nowhere left for either the management or the players to run. This was the beginning of a turning point. Either the club would change, or Kaminga would definitely leave the team, and the date when this decision would be made was fast approaching. The storm inside was growing. Behind the walls of the team, an invisible tension was present at every practice and every meeting. Nothing was normal anymore. Kaminga never backed down after saying those words. He didn't make any new statements on social media, nor did he feel the need to defend himself. He just came to the gym and continued to work. But this silence only amplified the impact of his words. Everyone was watching him, waiting impatiently to see what he would do. In the locker room, the atmosphere was growing colder by the day, like a bottle of water placed in a freezer. The cheerful voices of old were replaced by a deep silence during training. Even though no one spoke loudly, there was something in their eyes. The team now seemed divided in two. On one side were those who wanted the status quo to continue, and on the other were those who wanted young players like Kaminga to be given a chance. Among the veteran players, Draymond Green's silence made everyone even more nervous. Because Draymond's silence never meant indifference, he just watched, measured, and waited for the right moment. Then he would speak, and a single sentence was enough to change the atmosphere in the room. Now, he was just watching Kaminga. How does he react when he loses the ball in practice? Does he run back on defense? Does he lose focus? Or does he get more aggressive? He was collecting all these little details and saving them for when the right moment came. Kerr, on the other hand, was trying not to let anything show on the outside. He kept smiling at press conferences and gave short, calm answers to those who asked about Kaminga's departure. But inside, he felt the weight of the situation heavily. Because this wasn't just a player's request, it was a question that had been thrown at the very foundations of the system he had built over the years. And now he too had to answer that question. Late-night meetings began at the club headquarters. There were two options on the table for the management. Should Kaminga be given a bigger role and a new contract, or should he be traded? Making this decision was far from easy, because neither path had a way back. A young star demanding his own path so openly could actually uproot the club's future. While these discussions were ongoing, Kaminga, of course, did not stop working in the gym. In fact, he worked even harder. Every morning, he arrived before everyone else to practice shooting, lift weights, and do extra defense drills. This hard work caused the young players to grow even closer to him, because they were the ones who understood his situation best. Even when they talked among themselves, they often asked the same question: will our time really come, or will we always be like this? Kaminga had become a symbol among the young players on the team. His emergence represented not only his own future, but also their dreams. That's why they quietly supported him. This support drew an invisible line in the locker room. The young players stood in one corner, the veterans in the other, and when they looked at each other, they looked like two different teams. The pace of training gradually slowed down. Mistakes became more noticeable. Even the smallest things grew. For example, a passing mistake that everyone used to laugh at could now become a big problem. This situation was slowly destroying the harmony within the team. Draymond finally broke his silence during a training session. He stood on the court with a stern voice and raised his voice so that everyone could hear him, saying, "If you want to be a veteran, play like a veteran." This sentence was directed at Kaminga, but it was actually a warning to everyone else. He was telling them that the remaining respect within the team had to be preserved. At that moment, the atmosphere in the gym grew even heavier. Kaminga said nothing. He just stared at Draymond and didn't look away for a second. Sometimes silence is a more powerful response than words. After practice, no one spoke, but everyone felt the impact of that moment. There was no turning back now. Either this storm would shake the foundations of the club, or everyone would have to adapt to this new reality. After this incident, rumors in the league grew even more. Managers of rival teams began to send silent messages to Golden State. What is Kaminga's situation? Will you sit down at the trade table? What do you want? These questions kept the club's phones ringing non-stop, because everyone knew that this kind of tension was very rare, and that if it wasn't dealt with at the right moment, it would inevitably explode. Steph Curry, meanwhile, was trying to remain silent amid all the commotion, because he hadn't taken sides or made any statements. But everyone knew that a single word from Steph could end the storm in an instant. Still, he chose to wait, because maybe this time, this story needed to find its own way. Kerr was running out of time. The meetings in the front office had to come to a decision. This decision would determine not only Kaminga's future, but also the direction Golden State would take in the coming years. And that day was approaching. The silence in the locker room was no longer just silence. It had turned into the roar before a storm. Everyone knew something was about to happen. When and how was unclear, but it was certain that the tension could not be sustained any longer. There was one day left on the calendar, the management meeting. The importance of this meeting was evident on the faces of everyone who entered the clubhouse. When the doors closed, the air inside grew heavy. Steve Kerr sat at one end of the table, and the team's managers sat at the other. In the silence, only the sound of pens and the turning of pages could be heard. The topic was clear, and nothing else would be discussed. Only Kaminga's future. The club president was the first to speak. The fatigue in his eyes was evident. This issue was no longer just a contract dispute. It had become a cultural debate. Would they trust their young star and give him a bigger role, or would they part ways? There were no other options left. Kerr took a deep breath. He was trying to appear calm, but the lines on his face betrayed his exhaustion and anger. He had been a defender of this system for a long time. The spirit of this team had been built on patience, harmony, and humility. But now one of the cornerstones of that spirit was being shaken. When he broke the silence, everyone in the room held their breath. Whatever came next, there would be no turning back. Kerr's words were simple and clear. I value him. I've done a lot for his development. But the fact is, I can't allow anything that disrupts this order. These words revealed one aspect of the decision, but everyone knew that this was no longer just a technical decision. The team's internal balance also had to be preserved. What Steph Curry would say at this point would also be decisive, but Steph was still silent. This silence was perhaps a choice, but it was also a sign of tension, of course. While the meeting was going on, a different scene was unfolding in the locker room. As the team gathered after practice, no one was talking, and all eyes were on the door. Kaminga was shooting hoops with his head down. A few young players had gathered around him. The veterans had retreated to their corners. The distance between the two groups was growing step by step. And then something unexpected happened. A news story leaked to the press and stirred things up even more. A sentence attributed to Kaminga shook the place. The problem is Kerr. It was unclear whether these words had actually come from Kaminga, but their impact was huge. Suddenly, phones were ringing, and social media was already ablaze. While all hell was breaking loose outside, the atmosphere in the meeting room was tense. When Kerr heard the news, his face froze. Did those words really come from Kaminga? Or could this be someone's game? Whatever the truth was, everyone's perception was now very clear. This matter had long since become personal. During the rest of the meeting, management laid out different scenarios one by one. If he were traded, to whom and under what conditions? If he were kept, for how long and in what role? All these questions were on the table in front of them, but none of the answers came easily. Days passed. During this time, the silence within the team grew even deeper. Everyone went their own way on the training court. Draymond's gaze was harder, Clay's face was more expressionless, and Steph's steps were heavier. It was as if each of them could clearly see that this team was slowly splitting into two different worlds. One day during practice, the silence was broken once again. Draymond raised his voice more harshly this time. Don't forget who this team is. Everyone stood still. Kaminga raised his head, his eyes determined. It was as if his gaze already conveyed that he stood behind his words. That moment was a snapshot of the breakdown in the locker room. Now, there was a clear line drawn. No one knew whether this line would be crossed or whether they would drift further apart. Steph Curry didn't say a word that day either, but there was a different expression on his face. It was as if he was close to making a decision. His steps were slow but heavy. The quietest but strongest member of the team was waiting again. Waiting was his strength, and by the end of that day, everyone felt it. The decision was near. Something was going to happen, and this waiting would come to an end. There was no turning back. Either Kaminga would chart his own course, or Golden State would turn the page. But no matter which path they chose, this story would never return to the quiet days of the past. The countdown had begun. Everyone's eyes were on Steph, on what he would do, on what decision Kerr would make, and on which path the club would take. In this waiting, breaths were held, and seconds felt like minutes. As the days passed, an invisible pressure grew inside the team's headquarters. Every news article and every rumor shared on social media added to the weight of that pressure. They were no longer just in a crisis. They were at a turning point. The tension surfaced once again as the team was at the airport for an away game. As the players stepped off the bus, cameras and reporters gathered around, all searching for one name: Jonathan Kaminga. When the microphones were extended toward him, a single question was asked. "Do you want a trade?" Kaminga paused, a faint smile appearing on his face. He said nothing, simply continuing to walk. This silence created a noise louder than any words could have. At that moment, the cameras turned to Kerr to capture his reaction, but Kerr lowered his gaze. He didn't speak either. On the team plane, the atmosphere was even colder. The young players sat in their corners with their headphones on. The veterans quietly glanced at newspapers or looked at their phones. No one even looked at anyone else. Steph Curry sat by the window, watching the clouds roll by outside. His face was expressionless, but a storm was raging inside his mind. When game day arrived, there was a different energy in the locker room than usual. Even the fans in the stands could feel the difference when the players took the court to warm up. Kaminga played with explosive energy on the court. He wanted the ball on every offense and stuck to his opponent on every defense. The fans could feel his fire up close. It was as if he wanted to write his own story. When the game ended, the stats sheet showed that it was one of the best performances of his career. But even that performance didn't ease the tension for a moment. When they returned to the locker room, there was silence for a moment. Then Draymond Green stood up. He crossed his arms across his chest and began to speak loudly. "Remember why this team was built. Everyone here has a role to play. This is not a place for personal desires, but for sacrifice. If you want something, you have to earn it first." The target of these words was clear, but Kaminga didn't move an inch. He just listened quietly. When Draymond fell silent, Kaminga stood up. He turned his face toward him and spoke calmly. "I came here to win too, but I don't want to be ignored anymore." These words echoed in the locker room. It wasn't a clash, nor was it a threat, but it cast a heavy shadow over everyone, because it was the first time Kaminga had ever spoken up for himself. From that day on, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, Steph was among those gathered in the management office. His silence was over. In the middle of the meeting, everyone's eyes turned to him. He began to speak in a calm voice. "We will decide what will happen to this team. This is not a matter for one player or one person. This is the future of the club." Then he paused and pointed to Kaminga. "But if we lose him, we may lose our future." Steph's words sent a ripple through the room. For the first time in years, he had taken sides. Kerr looked up and remained silent for a long time. There was a calmness in Steph's eyes, but beneath that calmness, a determination shone through. With his words, the tone of the discussion changed. After the meeting, rumors spread quickly throughout the clubhouse. No official decision had been announced yet, but everyone had already heard what Steph had said. Kaminga's future was no longer completely uncertain, but this uncertainty had turned into another question. Would Steph's support be enough to end the tension, or would it only delay the crisis a little longer? While a solution plan that would demonstrate Kaminga's value was being prepared within the club, trade scenarios were still on the table. No one knew which path would be chosen. However, one thing was certain: This crisis was no longer just a matter for Golden State, but had become a topic of conversation throughout the entire league. As the pace of training increased, all eyes were on Kaminga's every move. After Steph's words, his responsibility had doubled. Now he had to prove not only his talent, but also that he deserved this support. Every turnover, every defensive mistake attracted more attention, while every good move began to earn more applause. In the locker room before the team's next game, the tension was at its peak. The time had come for the decision to be announced. Everyone was waiting for an announcement. Shortly after, a call came from the management office. Kaminga, Kerr, and Steph were invited upstairs at the same time. Those who remained in the locker room waited silently. The door closed. What would happen inside might change the fate of this dynasty. And when the door closed, everyone outside felt that something had come to an end. Either the storm would subside and a new era would begin, or the club would be on the verge of an irreversible split. Silence reigned in the room for a while. 3 people, 3 different pasts, and 3 different minds sat around the same table. Kerr spoke first. His voice was tired but clear. This team has had an identity for years. We have achieved everything through discipline, sharing, and patience. I cannot allow this order to be disrupted. Jonathan, I am not questioning your talent, but the path you have chosen is a very difficult one, and you must think carefully about where it will lead you. Kaminga raised his head. There was no hesitation on his face. I have already waited for years. I did everything you asked. I was the first one on the field, every day. I worked tirelessly in training, but I don't want to be ignored anymore. If you believe I am part of this team's future, you have to show me. Otherwise, I am ready to go my own way, and I will chart it myself. His voice did not rise as he spoke these words, but his determination filled the room. Steph had been silent up until that point. He leaned toward the table and looked both of them in the eye as he began to speak. We've been fighting together on this team for years. We've all paid different prices at different times. But here's what I see. If we want to move forward, we have to build bridges. Kaminga could be the future of this team. Giving him a chance is not just his responsibility, it's ours. Steph's words changed the atmosphere in the room. For the first time, there seemed to be a balance. Kerr turned to him. It is certainly my job to preserve the value of this order, he said. But what you say is also true. Perhaps it is now necessary to make a change within this order. The meeting went on for hours. At times, voices rose. At others, there were long silences. Eventually, a decision was made. The team management would send Kaminga a clear message. They would trust him and give him more responsibility, but it would also be a test. If he succeeded, his name would be written in gold letters in the future of the Golden State. If he failed, they would part ways. When the door opened, the players in the hallway looked up. They tried to read each other's faces. No one said anything. Kaminga just walked forward, a determined look on his face. Steph walked silently behind him. Kerr's gaze was stern, but it also held the weight of a decision. The next morning, the decision was announced to the team. Kaminga would now be getting more playing time and more responsibility, but this came at a price. Everyone would now expect not only talent, but also leadership from him. The announcement caused a moment of stunned silence in the locker room. The young players looked at each other with hope, while the veterans appeared cautious. When the first game arrived, the atmosphere on the court was different than usual. The fans were on their feet with every move Kaminga made, and his teammates watched him intently, wondering what he would do. When Kaminga entered the game and got the ball, the entire arena fell silent. Everyone was waiting to see how he would seize this opportunity. The first quarter started calmly. He didn't rush. He made the right passes and played tough defense. In the second quarter, he started to find his rhythm. His determination was different this time as he drove to the basket. There was a flurry of activity on the bench after every score. Steph cheered him on from the sidelines, while Draymond watched him closely. By the final moments of the game, the ball was in his hands. The score was tied. Everyone held their breath during the final play. Kaminga drove toward the basket, outmaneuvered the defense, and dropped the ball into the net. The arena fell silent, and when the ball went through the net, the entire crowd erupted. The game-winning basket, of course, came from him. At that moment, the sound of the stands rose to the sky. Kaminga clenched his fists and raised his head. There was no anger on his face, just a sense of relief. It was as if he had left some of the weight he had been carrying on his shoulders for years right there, in that moment. His teammates rushed to his side. Draymond touched his shoulder. Steph silently smiled and nodded his head in approval. It looked like just a game, but it meant so much more. It was the beginning of a new era. But when they returned to the locker room, everyone knew that the story was not over yet. This was just the beginning. Now the real question was, would this new chapter revive the Golden State dynasty? Or would it slowly turn into the beginning of a path of no return? The answer lay in the days ahead. But that night, everyone felt the same thing. The doors to a new era had been opened, and the first step had been taken. And the story that began in silence had now entered an irreversible path. Kaminga's words had transcended a single sentence, becoming a turning point that would alter the fate of an entire club. Would this tension eventually come to an end, or would it lead to a different confrontation? No one knew. But one thing was certain: the Golden State Warriors would never be the same again. Do you think Kaminga's bold move will revive the Warriors, or will it spell the end of an era? Share your thoughts in the comments and join the discussion. See you in the next story.